In my last video, I started work on Revell's Ornithopter, a design licensed from the 1984 movie Dune. Today, join me as I fill seams, prime, paint, and just about lose my mind working with some fiddly pieces of brass rod. It's all coming up next on Scale Icons. In the Vintage Build series, I look back in time and use some old photos to show you how I built some of my favorite models in years past. Today, it's part 2 of my Dune Ornithopter build, a kit I built between the winter of 2017 and the fall of 2019. If you're just joining me now, you can find a link to part 1 in the description below. So with the completion of the cockpit and cabin details, I moved on to addressing the kit's most glaring inaccuracy. Although not included on the blueprints, both the studio model and the film set featured a series of horizontal bars over the windscreen. But in designing the kit, Revell took the easy way out by simply molding raised bars onto the thick green-tinted windscreen. I hated the look of the molded on bars, and I hated the green tint, and I hated how thick that clear styrene was. Fabricating a series of horizontal bars that fill the window frames should have been an easy job. Cut a simple window insert from thin, crystal clear styrene, snip a few lengths of wire. Simple, right? But because I'd forgotten to take into account the slight offset of my wire cutters, I ended up measuring, cutting, and repeating more times than I care to remember. But once I realized what I was doing wrong, things went together more quickly. Installation was another exercise in frustration, almost an hour's worth, but eventually they were in place, level, and secured with superglue. I started filling seams and then gave everything a nice coat of black primer. Not only did this prepare the surface for the eventual grubby and faded black finish, I hoped it would act as a good light block for the cockpit. Something of a setback though. The seams along the 2 ribbed fuselage arms stubbornly refused to hold the old filler putty I'd been using. I had the same problem trying to fill and sand and resand some pits on the bulbs at the back end of these arms that were caused when I removed these brittle plastic parts from the sprues. The putty kept chipping and dropping out. I don't know if it was the quality of the plastic or the age of my putty, but replacing my old tube with a fresh one seemed to do the trick. After all this frustration, I needed a break, so I decided to turn my attention to something simple: the base. I started with a simple wooden plaque from Michaels. I picked it because there was a hollow space underneath it for the circuit board and the power supply. I also picked it because it was cheap. After applying stain and varnish, I masked off an area to protect the base for when the groundwork would eventually be applied. With the base prepared, I decided to really start getting some paint down, starting with the cockpit. Using Model Master acrylics, I gave it a base of steel followed by a grimy black wash. Dry brushing with the base coat brought out the shapes and I think nicely replicated the grimy metallic appearance of the filming set. Details on the instrument panel and throughout the cockpit were reproduced with Model Master brass and some sparing use of gloss black. At this point, I still had to drill out areas where the fiber optics would replicate the instrument lights. And that bare white plastic you're seeing is a component of the 2-part window frame I built to sandwich in the clear styrene replacing the thick green-tinted kit part. Moving on to those stubby wings, I painted them with jet exhaust and gave them a nice black wash before a bit of judicious dry brushing was applied. It's a nice subtle effect, and I then carefully hit them with a few oily streaks and some rusty pastels. Figures now, or more precisely, converting some existing figures, since the Revell kit didn't come with any. Because the kit is approximately 1/48 scale, I started with Tamiya's 1/48 scale World War II German Africa Corps figure set. It gave me a nice variety of figures to work with, as well as some greeblies I would use in the Ornithopter interior. I knew 1/48 would be small, but holy smokes were these guys ever tiny. First order of business was to find some decent screen references for the Harkonnen uniforms. Now, nobody watching should be surprised to learn that finding good pictures of costumes barely on screen in a 35-year-old cinematic flop was no easy feat. Of course, the number of people who could look at the figures and call me out for inaccuracies was admittedly pretty small, but OCD is considered a disorder for a reason. There are 3 seats in the cockpit, so I picked out 3 figures. The sole seated figure from the Tamiya kit would replicate a pilot, and 2 standing figures would be used to pose outside the aircraft. Next, I started sanding down all the existing uniform details: pockets, epaulets, hats, etc. New uniform shapes were created with some very thin styrene stock. The hobby knife provides some scale and gives you an idea of how damn small these figures actually are. After all this work, I decided to abandon one of the standing figures because I wasn't overly happy with how it turned out. The posture seemed kinda wonky. With the figures built, it was time to paint them. But my enthusiasm for this step quickly evaporated. As difficult as it was to physically modify them, I was about to be reminded exactly why I hated painting figures so much. After priming with acrylic light gray, I switched to enamels to work on the faces and hands. I used a military brown for shadows, a custom mix of sand and military brown for skin, and radome tan for highlights, and then used a brush dampened with thinner to blend the 3 together. The red hair was a custom mix of a variety of acrylic paints, including military brown, sand, and Chevy engine red. I returned to acrylics for the uniforms and created various tones using aircraft interior black and dark gray. As acrylics won't blend like enamels will, I coated everything with a very thin glaze of the base coat. Boots, belts, and other small details were aircraft interior black. Once everything was dry, I shot them with a haze of clear matte to bring the shine down. Not the greatest, but then again, these things are tiny. The standing figure is not quite 3.5 centimeters tall, and that's a little less than 1.5 inches for any American viewers. And that's how I spent the weekend, hunched over my hobby desk holding tiny figures in front of a small magnifying glass and developing a wicked case of eyestrain. Because the Ornithopter would have an all-black finish, I decided to experiment with something a bit different to create a faded and weathered appearance. I tried dry brushing before pre-shading. I'll be honest, this was my first all-black model, so I was really in unfamiliar country here. I carefully blended the dry brushing on the raised areas with a very thin mix of flat aircraft interior black, which has a lighter, warmer tone than plain old flat black. I saved that for the recesses and lower areas. I went much thinner than normal with this blending coat because I know from experience that black has a habit of completely obscuring whatever it's applied over. Next, I applied a very thin pin wash made from semi-gloss black along all the raised edges to create a sense of shadow and depth. A final dusting of flat black helped to feather the sharp edges left by the pin wash. Once this second feather coat was complete, I looked on my works and despaired. There still wasn't enough contrast between the raised surfaces and the recessed areas. The finish still looked toy-like and without a good sense of scale. I decided to take a risk and loaded up my airbrush with some thinned, semi-gloss black and sparingly applied it along those same edges I used the pin wash on, as well as recessed areas all over the model. The semi-gloss is a much darker and cooler shade of black and provided some excellent contrast with the other shades of flat black. And this did the trick. The model now looked more realistic, even organic. I had originally planned to coat it all with a clear matte finish, but I was really digging the contrast between the matte and the semi-gloss finishes. It's hard to tell in the photos, but there's a nice, oily quality to it that seems to be in line with the production design from the original movie. In the next episode of this vintage build series, it'll be time to light this sucker up. Atomics! And remember my concerns about brittle plastic? Well, my fears were going to be realized at the worst possible moment. Don't forget to check out my other videos on Revell's Ornithopter, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. You've been watching Scale Icons, and I'll see you soon at the workbench.